Welcome back. In this lecture, we're looking at the rise of schools and the scholastic method of doing Christian theology. And we begin with the Mendicant orders, which arise in the 13th century. First, some background. As the church becomes established in the so-called Middle Ages, we find two kinds of priests, secular and regular clergy. But these terms do not mean what you probably think they mean. Secular clergy, the term secular refers to the Latin saeculum, which means the world. So secular clergy tend to be in cities and towns. So this is your average everyday priest in your local city, town. You'd call him a regular priest, except that regular clergy are priests who follow a regula, that is the Latin word for a rule, a monastic code like the Rule of Saint Benedict. And in fact, the most common order for monks at this time is the Benedictine order. And by the way, all orders of monks have initials following their names. And for the Benedictines, it's OSB, the Order of Saint Benedict. And at this time, preaching is really in decline. Priests are not teaching people the Bible or the Christian faith because the sacrament of the Mass has become the central focus of Christian worship. This starts to change, however, in the 13th century with the rise of the Mendicant orders. These are really reform movements. Mendicants are called friars. That is from the Latin fratres, brother. They are fraternities, basically. They also establish sororities with nuns, sisters, but they don't usually have frat parties. In any case, they're called mendicants, also from a Latin-based word that means beggars. They live off of donations, people's charity, and they are itinerant. That is, they wander around, and rather than living in a monastery, they go around begging for food. They own no property. They travel around. The first mendicant order was the Carmelites, and they were founded around 1154 in the Holy Land during the Crusades. Their origins are rather obscure. They're not really that important. Much more important is the order of the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209. OFM stands for the Order of Friars Minor, which means the Little Brothers. And they emphasize humility. That's why they're called the Little Brothers. And that's why the current Pope, Pope Francis, chose the name. Now, the original Francis, Francis of Assisi, was born to a wealthy Italian family, and he later dedicated himself to a life of poverty and penance and devotion to God.
Pie Iesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Pie Iesu Domine, dona eis requiem.
Okay, then. So Francis's most famous saying is preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. Unfortunately, he never said any such thing because Francis was a preacher. And whoever attributed that saying to St. Francis certainly didn't know much about St. Francis. In fact, St. Francis even preached to critters, supposedly birds, animals, platypuses, that kind of thing. The next important mendicant order was the Dominican order, founded in 1216. Their initials, OP, stands for Order of Preachers. Now, my son who plays video games thinks OP stands for overpowered characters and things, but anyway. Now, a Spanish priest by the name of Dominic served as a missionary to a heretical group called the Cathars, also called the Albigenses, in Eastern Europe, and they were basically medieval Gnostics. But his mission to the Cathars failed, largely because of the terrible lack of theological education, not only among the general populace, but also among the clergy. The clergy were not very well trained. And the Cathar sect was very resilient and resistant, and it was very attractive to people, not least of all because they treated women as equals, complete equals to men, which was definitely not the case in the Catholic Church. So Dominic focused his order on theological education and theological study, and he wanted to produce more teachers. And from the Dominicans come some of the great medieval theologians, including Thomas Aquinas. So the Dominicans start schools in Paris, Bologna, and Rome. And these are, not coincidentally, also where the first universities will arise. Another order is the Augustinian Hermits, an order created by the Pope in the year 1256. Their abbreviation is OESA, the Order of the Eremites, that is Hermits, of St. Augustine. And their emphasis is on the study of the writings of St. Augustine, which makes sense, and the study of Scripture. And that's significant because of a certain Augustinian monk who comes along several centuries later by the name of Martin Luther. And he would come to his reforming views through the study of Scripture and the writings of St. Augustine. Now, the Franciscans and the Dominicans are the two most important orders in terms of Christian teaching, and there was a certain rivalry between these two orders, and they differed on some crucial points. So, first of all, the Franciscans, they emphasize love, and they emphasize the faculty of the will, both the human will and the divine will. Whereas the Dominicans put more emphasis on knowledge and the intellect, and that leads to some considerable differences in doctrine. So the Franciscans end up emphasizing good works and acts of love, because they emphasize love, and human free will. The Dominicans, on the other hand, emphasize God's election and his grace to the elect, whom he foreknows from eternity. But as a friend of mine says, the Franciscans and Dominicans do agree on one thing: they both hate those Jesuits. Important to note, however, that there is diversity of thought. It's important to note, however, that there is a lot of diversity of thought in the Catholic tradition. It is not monolithic. Education was rather haphazard in the medieval period, in medieval Europe until the 13th century. Most of the populace was uneducated. There were monastic schools out in rural areas. There were cathedral schools in cities. There were a few secular schools, for example, in royal courts. But there was no uniformity in education, and it was almost entirely for priests and monks. The first and the oldest university was the University of Bologna in the 12th century. But it had been operating actually as far back as the 11th century, 1088. And if you don't know where Bologna is, it's in the Deli aisle. No, actually, it's really in northern Italy. The most important center for the study of theology was the University of Paris, which emerged at the end of the 12th century, also known as the Sorbonne. Now, about the scholastic method, which was taught in these universities. Before the 12th century, theological writing was just as haphazard as education and theological education. Theological writing came in the form of sermons and treatises, but there were rarely any comprehensive treatments of the Christian faith. So as theology becomes increasingly more sophisticated, it requires a more robust method in order to be taught and defended in a university setting. And the method that develops in the schools is called the scholastic method, simply because scholastic means academic, related to the schools. In scholastic theology, Asking the right question is very important. Ask the wrong question and you skew the inquiry. So the quaestio method develops. Quaestio is Latin for question. It develops as a form of careful intellectual inquiry. Peter Abelard was a 12th century theologian, wrote a book called Sic et Non, Yes and No. And in it, Abelard sets forth conflicting views of the church father. He sets them side by side. And Abelard's book was a bit scandalous. He was a bit scandalous because he exposed these contradictions among the church fathers, and also because he was kind of notorious for a love affair that he had with a woman named Heloise. But in any case, the point was for students of theology to work through these contradictions among the fathers and try to find harmony between them. And I've already mentioned a book in our very first lecture. I mentioned Peter Lombard's 4 books of the sentences. Sentences here means anything but sentences. It means opinions, thoughts, ideas, propositions. And so these 4 books are structured around the topics of Trinity, creation, Christ, and the sacraments. And it becomes the standard textbook for theology in universities and remains so for 400 years. By the way, there was no Kindle edition. Now, many older characterizations of scholasticism that you might read are particularly biased, exceptionally skewed, and they reflect the view that everything medieval is inferior, talked about that earlier, and that scholasticism was a theology of dry, dead, arid rationalism. But in fact, scholasticism, the scholastic method, was just that. It was an academic method, and a pretty good one at that. A robust one, an effective one. It's deeply rooted, first of all, in biblical exegesis, as I mentioned in our earliest lectures, and it's a method that makes careful distinctions, intellectual distinctions, which also arise from interpreting the biblical text. And how do you reconcile apparent contradictions in the biblical text? And it's a method that's designed to train pastors, not just ivory tower theologians. And so it is practical in its intentions. And in addition to the quaestio, by the way, there's also a technique, a pedagogical technique, called the disputatio, basically a debate, where one person would defend a thesis or a set of theses, and others would raise objections to the theses. And this form of scholastic pedagogy lies behind Martin Luther's 95 Theses. It's a typical medieval way of conducting academic discourse. Now, Thomas Aquinas uses the quaestio method in his massive work on doctrine, the Summa Theologiae. First, there is the question itself, or what we would call the main topic. For example, question 12, how God is known by us. And this is followed by a number of articles or sub-questions. For example, Article 12 of question 12, whether God can be known in this life by natural reason. Then, after posing the question, Aquinas will deal with objections or arguments or evidence that he will refute, contrary evidence. And this part begins something like, it would seem that, and whatever he says there, you know, is going to be the opposite of what Aquinas really thinks. And the number of objections, usually there's about 3, but the number can vary. Then this is followed by the sed contra, that is, on the contrary, where Thomas supplies the most convincing bit of evidence for his position. In this case, he cites Romans 1:19, where Paul says that the Gentiles have a natural knowledge of God. They know God by nature. Then there is Thomas's full response called De Respondeo, and he lays out there his viewpoint in detail. And then finally, Thomas will respond to each of the objections in turn. For example, odd 1 means his response to objection 1, and so forth. Now, a factor that's very important for understanding later medieval scholasticism is the rediscovery by Europeans of many of Aristotle's works, because only a few of Aristotle's writings were available in Latin, and knowledge of Greek had been lost in the West. But through the Muslim presence in Spain, these works were introduced to Europe, and many considered Aristotle to be an exciting resource for theology and the other sciences. Now, there were some problematic aspects of Aristotle for Christian theology. For example, his view that the soul dies with the body, his doctrine of God as an impersonal force, and his belief that natural reason was all that was required for human flourishing. But there were also many positive aspects of Aristotle that could be adapted and modified. So, for example, Aristotle's view of logic was attractive to many. His view of ethics had a lot going for it. Aristotle's view of nature and of the reliability of the human senses is much more positive than that of Plato, who says that the material world is like a prison and only the world of thought and spirit is good. Now, those ideas are much more at home in Gnosticism than in Christianity. And so Aristotle, who has much more respect for the natural world and for the ability to perceive and understand that world, that's much more amenable to Christian thought. And perhaps most important is Aristotle's view of causality, his idea of fourfold causality. And this is a very important idea in both in medieval theology and early modern theology. For Aristotle, everything has four causes or explanations, and that word cause does not always correspond to our normal sense of the term cause, by the way. The classic example that's used to illustrate this is a statue. So the material cause is the stuff or matter of something. So with the illustration of a statue is made out of bronze or marble. The formal cause is the form that something takes. And so, for example, marble carved into human form becomes a statue. That's its formal cause. The efficient cause is the agent or the maker of a thing. So, for example, a sculptor would be the efficient cause of a statue. And the final cause refers to the purpose or the goal of something. So, again, with our example of the statue, the final cause may be to bring fame to the sculptor, or to bring beauty to the city, or to represent the emperor in far-off cities across the empire. Now, reactions to Aristotle varied. Some people were extremely excited and enthusiastic about Aristotle's philosophy and its potential to impact positively the sciences and theology. Maybe a little bit like Charles Taylor today. Some people thought that Aristotle was the best thing since indoor plumbing. And that's saying something because indoor plumbing hadn't been invented yet. These super zealous Aristotelians were called Averroists, after the Spanish Muslim scholar, a super scholar really, Averroes, who died in 1198, who was a major figure in introducing Aristotle to the West. Others thought that Aristotle was practically from the devil and only contaminated Christian thought. They considered Aristotle to be a threat to the church. But in the middle, there were many theologians who found much of value in Aristotle and used many of his ideas and methods, but they used him critically. So when he conflicted with Christian doctrine, they rejected Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas was one of these moderate Aristotelians, moderate adapters of Aristotle. We'll discuss Thomas in more detail in our next lecture.